The wind, a relentless mourner, swept across the parched expanse of what had once been the Bar M Ranch, carrying with it the fine, choking dust of failed dreams and the scent of impending loss. It was a sound Elara Hayes had grown to dread, a prelude to the silence that had consumed her father, then the land, and now, it seemed, her own future. She huddled in the shadowed corner of the empty horse stall, the rough-hewn wood pressing cold against her back, a stark contrast to the feverish anxiety coiling in her belly. Her fingers, stained with the grime of desperate, solitary labor, twisted the worn fabric of her skirt. The calico faded to a near ghost of its former pattern, much like the vibrancy of her own spirit. Today was the day the creditors, circling like buzzards over a dying calf, would pick clean the bones of her inheritance. And she, Elara, was the final, most debased item on their cruel inventory. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her, bitter as gall. Her father, a man whose laughter had once boomed louder than any prairie thunderstorm, had been whittled down by drought and debt, his strong hands eventually stilled by a grief too heavy for his heart to bear. He'd left her with nothing but the echoing silence of the empty house and the crushing weight of his obligations. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Blackwood whose smile never reached his eyes, had arrived yesterday, his voice oily and confident as he surveyed the meager offerings. Livestock already gone, sold for a pittance. Farm implements, rusted and worn. Household goods, imbued with the ghosts of her mother's gentle touch, now poured over by strangers. And then Blackwood's gaze had settled on her, a speculative gleam that made her skin crawl. A healthy girl, he'd remarked to his clerk, loud enough for her to overhear. Shame about the circumstances. Still, some might find a use. A use? Like a broodmare or a scullery maid without wages. The degradation of it burned in her throat, a silent scream trapped behind a wall of carefully constructed composure. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears, not out here. Later, perhaps, when the vast, indifferent sky was her only witness. But not now. The air thickened with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and the sour anticipation of the crowd gathering beyond the barn doors. Voices, coarse and greedy, drifted in, punctuated by the occasional rough laugh. Each sound was a hammer blow against her fraying nerves. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to engulf her. Where could she run? The nearest town was 2 days' ride, and she had no horse, no money, nothing but the threadbare dress she wore and a name that was now synonymous with ruin. Fear was a living thing inside her, its icy tendrils constricting her breath, clouding her vision with a shimmering haze. She pressed her forehead against the dusty planks, trying to draw strength from their unyielding solidity. There had to be a way. But the plains stretched desolate in every direction, offering no solace, no escape. The sun climbed, its heat baking the dry earth, turning the barn into an oven. She could hear Blackwood's voice, louder now, commencing the grim proceedings. The lowing of a scrawny steer, the clatter of pots and pans. Each sail was a nail in the coffin of her old life. Her senses sharpened, not by hope, but by a primal instinct for survival, however doomed. The scent of horse sweat and old leather, the distant creak of a wagon wheel, the murmur of bartering voices, all became part of the tapestry of her terror. And then, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a ripple of unease through the crowd noise, like a stone dropped into a stagnant pond. A hush, quickly broken, but noticeable. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were coming for her. The heavy barn door groaned open, a rectangle of blinding, dust-filled sunlight momentarily obscuring the figures framed within. Elara flinched, shrinking further into the shadows, though she knew it was futile. Silas Blackwood entered first, his portly frame filling the doorway, a ledger clutched in one hand, a gavel in the other. His eyes, small and shrewd, scanned the dim interior, quickly locating her. A smirk played on his lips. Ah, there she is. The prize of the collection, gentlemen. His voice, amplified by the barn's emptiness, dripped with a syrupy mockery that made her stomach churn. Behind him, 2 rough-looking men, his hired enforcers, loitered with an air of bored menace. The crowd, a motley assembly of hard-bitten settlers, opportunistic drifters, and a few grimly curious townsfolk, pressed in behind them, their faces a mixture of avarice, pity, and morbid curiosity. Ilara felt their collective gaze like a physical weight, stripping her bare, judging her worth in dollars and cents. She rose slowly, her legs stiff and trembling, but she forced her chin up. If this was to be her end, she would meet it standing, not cowering like a frightened animal. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the gloom, illuminating the stark reality of her situation. Her father's tools hung on the walls, silent sentinels of a life's work come to naught. The scent of hay and manure, once comforting and familiar, now seemed to reek of decay. Blackwood gestured expansively. Ilara Hayes, gentleman. Daughter of the late Jedediah Hayes. Strong, healthy, and, shall we say, unencumbered. A few coarse chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Ilara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her fingernails digging into her palms. The humiliation was a brand, searing itself into her soul. She focused on a point just beyond Blackwood's shoulder, trying to detach herself from the scene, to become an observer rather than the spectacle. But the leering eyes, the whispered comments, the sheer, suffocating presence of the crowd made it impossible. "What am I bid for this fine young woman?" Blackwood began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of the auctioneer. Guaranteed to be a hard worker, accustomed to the privations of ranch life. Someone to warm your hearth, perhaps? Mend your clothes? The possibilities, gentlemen, are endless. He paused, letting his words hang in the stifling air. A man near the front, burly and unshaven, with piggish eyes, called out, $10. Another, leaner and with a nervous twitch, countered, $12. Ilara's blood ran cold. $12. The price of a decent sack of flour. This was what she was reduced to. She scanned the faces in the crowd, searching for a flicker of compassion, a hint of outrage. She found none. Only the impassive masks of self-interest or the overt calculations of men weighing her potential servitude against their coin. And then, a stillness. A subtle parting of the crowd near the entrance, like water yielding to a solid object. A figure stepped through, moving with a quiet deliberation that drew every eye. He was tall, much taller than any man there, his frame lean but powerful beneath a simple buckskin shirt and leggings. His black hair, long and straight, was held back by a beaded band. His face, copper-skinned and high-cheekboned, was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed not on Blackwood, but on her. A Lakota warrior. Here. So far from their usual lands. A ripple of unease, more potent this time, spread through the assembled men. Mutterings arose, a mixture of fear and hostility. The bidding faltered, died. Blackwood, momentarily nonplussed, scowled. "This is a private auction, friend. Unless you've coin to spend," the warrior said nothing. He simply continued to look at Ilara, his gaze intense, unwavering. It was not a leering gaze, not like the others. It was something else, something she couldn't decipher. In that moment, trapped between the crass commercialism of the auction and the unnerving scrutiny of this stranger, Ilara felt a new kind of fear, sharper and more profound, because it was laced with an agonizing thread of the unknown. Was he another vulture, circling in a different guise? Or something else entirely? The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the buzzing of a fly near a dusty window pane. Silas Blackwood, recovering his composure, puffed out his chest. "Well, now," he blustered, attempting to regain control. "If our silent friend has no business here, perhaps he'll allow us to continue. The bidding stands at $12. He looked expectantly at the crowd, but their attention remained riveted on the Lakota warrior, who had taken another slow, deliberate step into the barn. The two enforcers by Blackwood's side shifted uneasily, their hands moving instinctively towards the pistols tucked into their belts. The warrior's expression did not change, but his eyes, dark and piercing, flickered briefly towards them, a silent acknowledgement that was somehow more intimidating than any overt threat. He carried no visible firearm, only a knife sheathed at his hip and a bow slung across his back, yet an aura of formidable capability emanated from him, palpable as the oppressive heat. Then, he spoke. His voice was low, resonant, not loud but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. The words were not English, but Lakota, a language Ilara had heard only in fearful whispers and exaggerated tales. Though she could not understand their meaning, their tone was not aggressive, but measured, imbued with an undeniable authority. Blackwood frowned, his irritation growing. "I don't speak that jargon, friend. This is a lawful assembly. Either place a bid or be on your way." The warrior turned his gaze fully upon Blackwood. He spoke again, this time in heavily accented but understandable English. "She is not for sale." The statement was flat, unequivocal. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, went through the crowd. Blackwood's face reddened. "Not for sale?" "Everything of Jedediah Hayes is for sale, by order of his creditors. She is part of the estate, a chattel to be disposed of." "She is a woman," the warrior stated, his voice still quiet, yet cutting through Blackwood's bluster. "Not a horse. Not a blanket." Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. Someone, a stranger, an Indian warrior no less, was speaking a truth she had only dared to whisper in the most secret corners of her mind. But what did it mean? What were his intentions? The burly man who had bid $10 spat on the ground. "He's got no right. She's white. What's his interest?" Whispers of agreement followed. The warrior ignored them. He reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something, holding it out on his open palm. It was not coin. It was a collection of intricately carved bone ornaments and several fine, perfectly tanned beaver pelts, their fur gleaming even in the dim light. "For the debt owed on this land," he said, his gaze steady on Blackwood. "By her father." Blackwood stared at the offering, his expression a mixture of contempt and surprise. "Pelts and trinkets? I deal in currency, savage. Hard cash." "This is value," the warrior replied, his tone unyielding. "More than you offer for her life." Ilara watched, frozen, as this bizarre negotiation unfolded. The warrior was not bidding for her not in the way the others had. He was offering to settle a debt, her father's debt. But why? What could a lone Lakota warrior possibly owe Jedediah Hayes, or gain from such an exchange? The tension in the barn was thick enough to cut with a knife. The crowd murmured, confused and resentful. Blackwood's enforcers tensed, their expressions hardening. "This is irregular," Blackwood snapped, though a flicker of uncertainty now touched his eyes. The value of the pelts was undeniable, perhaps even exceeding the outstanding debt if sold to the right fur trader. "There are procedures, the procedure is," the warrior interrupted, his voice dropping to an almost dangerous softness, "that a debt is paid. I pay it. She is free of it." He took another step, closing the distance between himself and Blackwood, who involuntarily recoiled. The warrior was not physically touching him, yet his presence seemed to diminish the auctioneer, to strip him of his blustering authority. Ilara found herself holding her breath. This was not rescue in any conventional sense. It was a transaction, stark and strange, conducted over her head as if she were still property, yet the terms were utterly different. He was not buying her, but her freedom from the auction block. Or so it seemed. The silence stretched again, heavy with unspoken threats and calculations. Finally, Blackwood, perhaps sensing the shifting mood of the crowd, or perhaps intimidated by the warrior's unwavering resolve and the subtle threat in his eyes, made a decision. He licked his lips, his gaze darting from the pelts to the warrior, then to his enforcers who offered no confident support. "Very well," he conceded, his voice tight with resentment. "The debt is substantial. Those pelts, they might cover a portion." He was trying to save face, to maintain a semblance of control. The warrior simply waited, his expression unchanging. With a frustrated sigh, Blackwood gestured dismissively. "Take them. Consider the immediate debt on the girl settled." He couldn't bring himself to say she was free, only that this particular claim was resolved. He snatched the pelts and carvings from the warrior's outstretched hand with ill grace. "The auction for the girl is concluded." He turned abruptly. "The rest of the Hayes assets are still under lien," he announced to the grumbling crowd, trying to salvage his authority. But the focal point had shifted. The spectacle was over, though its ending was one no one had anticipated. The warrior turned his gaze back to Ilara. He offered no smile, no word of reassurance. He simply looked at her, then inclined his head almost imperceptibly towards the open barn door. An invitation? A command? She didn't know. But the leering eyes of the crowd were no longer on her with the same intensity. The immediate threat of being sold like cattle had passed, replaced by a vast, terrifying unknown. She looked at the Lakota warrior, this silent, imposing man who had just intervened in her life in the most bewildering way imaginable, and a new chapter of fear, mingled with a desperate, unformed hope, began. The crowd, grumbling and dissatisfied at being deprived of their morbid entertainment and potential bargain, began to disperse, casting resentful or fearful glances towards the Lakota warrior. Silas Blackwood, after a final glare in Ilara's direction, bustled out, shouting orders to his men about securing the remaining worthless remnants of the Bar M. Ilara remained standing in the dim light of the barn, her legs still trembling, her mind struggling to process the abrupt shift in her fate. One moment, she was chattel on the block, the next, she was, what? Indebted to a stranger? A captive of a different kind? The warrior had not moved. He stood near the doorway, a tall, silhouetted figure against the harsh glare of the outside world, waiting with an unnerving patience. The silence between them was profound, broken only by the receding sounds of the disgruntled crowd and the ever-present sigh of the wind. She should say something. Thank you? But the words felt inadequate, absurd even, for the magnitude of what had just occurred, and for the uncertainty that still engulfed her. His intervention had been decisive, yet his motives remained utterly opaque. He had spoken of her father's debt, but she knew of no such connection. Her father had few dealings beyond the local settlement, and certainly none she was aware of with any Lakota. She took a tentative step towards him, then another. As she drew closer, she could see the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of long years under sun and sky. There was a stillness about him, a rootedness to the earth that seemed almost alien in this place of broken dreams and shifting fortunes. When she was but a few feet away, he finally spoke, his voice still low, still accented. "You will come." It was not a question. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the same quiet authority he had displayed with Blackwood. Ilara's breath hitched. Come where? Why? The fear, which had momentarily receded, surged back, cold and sharp. She had been spared the auction, yes, but to what end? To be taken into the wilderness by this man she did not know, whose people were often portrayed as hostile, savage? Why? The word was a mere whisper, barely audible. Where are you taking me? He did not answer immediately. His dark eye scanned her face, searching, perhaps, for something she could not guess. Then, he said, away from this. He gestured vaguely with his chin, encompassing the barn, the remnants of the ranch, the place of her humiliation. It was an answer, and yet, no answer at all. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She was so tired, so hungry, so utterly overwhelmed. For weeks, she had lived on the edge of her nerves, fueled by dwindling hope and bitter coffee. Now, the strain was taking its toll. She swayed, and instinctively, he put out a hand, not to touch her, but to steady her by gripping her upper arm. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet surprisingly strong. The contact, brief as it was, sent a jolt through her, not of fear, precisely, but of a stark awareness of his physical presence, his power. He released her as soon as she regained her balance. "We leave now," he said. Before others returned with worse ideas. He was right, of course. Blackwood might be temporarily satisfied, but there were others in that crowd whose intentions had been far from honorable. And word would spread. A lone woman, now unowned, unprotected in the eyes of many. The thought spurred her into a reluctant compliance. She had no possessions to gather, nothing left to tie her to this place but ghosts and sorrow. She gave one last, lingering look around the barn, at the empty stalls that had once housed her father's prized horses, at the dusty hayloft where she had played as a child. A sob threatened to escape, but she choked it back. Weakness now would be a dangerous indulgence. With a deep, shuddering breath, she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. I will come. The warrior turned without another word and strode out into the harsh sunlight. Ilara hesitated for only a moment, then followed, stepping out of the shadows of her past and into a future that was terrifyingly blank. Outside, 2 horses stood patiently, their reins looped over a broken fence post. One was a sturdy, dun-colored mare, evidently his. The other was a finer-boned sorrel, a good horse, though thin and trail-worn. He gestured towards the sorrel. "This was your father's," he said. Ilara stared. It was Starlight, her father's favorite mare, gone missing weeks ago, presumed stolen or wandered off and perished. How had he come by her? The questions multiplied, but she dared not voice them. He swung gracefully onto his own horse, then waited, watching her. Ilara, clumsy with exhaustion and apprehension, managed to pull herself into the sorrel's saddle. It felt strange, unfamiliar after so long. Starlight shifted beneath her, as if recognizing a familiar weight. The warrior set off at a steady pace, heading not towards the settlement, but away from it, towards the vast, open plains to the west, towards the lands his people called home. Ilara followed, a solitary, forlorn figure trailing in his wake. The sun beat down mercilessly. The dust kicked up by the horse's hooves coated her throat and stung her eyes. She did not look back. There was nothing left to see. Only the unknown stretched before her, vast and indifferent, under the silent, watchful gaze of the Lakota warrior who rode ahead, leading her away from one kind of despair and into another. The journey stretched into an eternity of rhythmic hoofbeats and the oppressive silence of the plains. Days bled into one another, marked only by the relentless cycle of sun and stars, heat and chill. Ilara rode in a daze of exhaustion, fear, and a gnawing uncertainty that twisted her insides. The Lakota warrior, whose name she still did not know, remained an enigma. He rode ahead, a straight, unwavering figure, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his movements economical and precise. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was usually a brief, practical utterance, "Water here." Or, "We rest." He offered no explanations, no reassurances, no insight into his thoughts or intentions. His silence was a heavy blanket, smothering her attempts to understand, to predict. In the first few days, Ilara lived in a state of constant, heightened terror. Every rustle in the prairie grass, every distant coyote howl, every shadow cast by a passing cloud sent her heart racing. She expected violence, cruelty, the fulfillment of all the fearful stories she had heard about savages. She watched him covertly, trying to read some sign in his stoic demeanor, some hint of the fate that awaited her. But his face remained impassive, his actions purely functional. He hunted with a quiet efficiency, bringing down a rabbit or a prairie chicken with a single, well-aimed arrow. He shared the meager portions of cooked meat without comment, ensuring she ate before he did. When they made camp at night, he would build a small, smokeless fire, then choose a spot for himself some distance away, his back to her, facing outwards, a silent guardian against the unseen dangers of the darkness. He offered her a worn but clean blanket on the first night, laying it near her without a word. The gesture, small as it was, pricked through her fear, confusing her. It was an act of consideration, however impersonal. She found herself observing him more closely, not just for signs of threat, but with a dawning, reluctant curiosity. She noted the way he moved through the landscape, with a familiarity that spoke of a deep, intrinsic connection to it. He seemed to read the land like an open book, the faintest track in the dust, the direction of the wind, the subtle changes in vegetation, all held meaning for him. He found water in places she would have deemed barren, identified edible roots and berries she hadn't known existed. He was as much a part of this harsh, unforgiving environment as the wind and the sun. Her own ineptitude in this world was starkly apparent. She, who had grown up on a ranch, felt like a helpless child in the face of the wilderness. The skills her father had taught her in mending fences, tending livestock, managing a household, were useless here. She was a burden, she knew, clumsy and ignorant. This realization brought a fresh wave of shame, but also a flicker of something else, a grudging respect for his competence, his self-sufficiency. Her internal monologue was a tempest of conflicting emotions. Fear still held sway, but it was now punctuated by moments of bewilderment and, occasionally, a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself in a dream. She replayed the scene at the auction endlessly in her mind, trying to decipher his motives. She is not for sale. The words echoed, a counterpoint to Blackwood's crass pronouncements. He had paid a debt, he claimed. But what debt? And why her father? Jedediah Hayes had been a solitary man, especially after her mother's passing, not given to making deep connections outside his own small sphere. The sun beat down, the landscape offered little shade. Her skin, already weathered, grew darker, chapped by sun and wind. Thirst was a constant companion, though he always seemed to find enough water to keep them going. Hunger gnawed at her, accustomed as she was to more regular, if lately meager, meals. The simple, fire-cooked meat and occasional forage plants were sustenance, nothing more. One evening, as they made camp beside a shallow, slow-moving creek, a coyote pack began to howl, their voices eerily close in the twilight. Elara tensed, her hand instinctively going to her throat. The warrior, who had been cleaning his knife by the firelight, merely glanced up, his expression unchanged. He listened for a moment, then returned to his task. His lack of alarm, his calm presence, was strangely more reassuring than any spoken words could have been. She realized, with a jolt, that her immediate fear of him was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to lessen. It was being replaced by a different kind of anxiety, the anxiety of the unknown future, of the alien culture she was presumably being taken to, but the raw terror of his physical presence was diminishing. He was not the monster of her imagination. He was simply the man. A very different man, from a very different world, but a man nonetheless, who, for reasons she could not fathom, had plucked her from one terrible fate and was now leading her towards another, entirely uncertain one. The observation became her only defense, her only way of trying to cope with the overwhelming powerlessness of her situation. The landscape began to change subtly. The flat, endless prairie gradually gave way to rolling hills, then to more rugged country, dotted with stands of pine and juniper. The air grew cooler, especially at night. Elara guessed they were moving north and west, deeper into territory she had only ever heard about in hushed, fearful tones, the domain of the Lakota. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm swept across the plains. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and the wind rose to a furious howl, whipping rain and hail before it with stinging force. Elara, caught unprepared, cowered beside her horse, soaked and shivering within minutes. The warrior, with swift efficiency, had already sought shelter for their mounts in a shallow ravine, then pulled Elara under the overhang of a rocky outcrop. They were pressed close, not by choice, but by the fury of the elements. The wind shrieked around them, and lightning split the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Elara, despite herself, flinched at each explosion of sound, her fear of the storm momentarily eclipsing her fear of the man beside her. He sat impassively, his gaze fixed on the tempest outside, seemingly unaffected by its violence. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of smoke and pine that clung to him. In that moment of shared vulnerability to the raw power of nature, a tiny, almost imperceptible shift occurred within her. He was not her enemy in this. They were both subject to the storm's impartial wrath. When the worst of it had passed, leaving behind a rain-washed world and the smell of damp earth, he rose and began to gather twigs for a fire, his movements economical despite the chill. He managed to coax a flame to life from the damp wood with a skill that amazed her. He then handed her a piece of dried meat from his pouch. "Eat," he said, his voice gruff. She took it, her fingers numb with cold. As she chewed the tough, smoky meat, she watched him. He was checking the horses, soothing the still nervous starlight with a low murmur and a gentle hand on her neck. The gesture was unexpectedly tender, a contrast to his usual stoic reserve. Later, as they rode on through the cleansed landscape, the air fresh and cool, Elara found herself thinking about her father. He had loved storms, her father. He would stand on the porch of their small house, watching the lightning, a look of awe on his face. A pang of grief, sharp and sudden, pierced through her exhaustion. She missed him. Missed the simple certainties of her old life, however hard it had become. This new existence was all shifting sands and shadows. That evening, as they made camp, the warrior did something unusual. After he had prepared their meager meal and they had eaten in their customary silence, he took a piece of charred wood from the fire and, on a flat piece of rock, began to draw. He drew a simple map, lines and circles, symbols she didn't understand. Then, he pointed to one part of it, then gestured vaguely towards the direction they were heading. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. He was trying to communicate something about their destination. Ilara stared at the crude drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration. She couldn't decipher it, but the attempt, the effort to bridge the vast gulf of language and culture between them, was significant. It was the first time he had actively tried to include her, to offer even a sliver of information. She shook her head slowly, unable to comprehend. A flicker of something, frustration? Resignation? Crossed his face, so fleeting she almost missed it. He wiped the drawing clean with his hand. The moment passed, but it lingered in Ilara's mind. He was not entirely indifferent to her state of confusion. Perhaps he understood, on some level, the terror of being led blindly into an unknown fate. As the days wore on, her fear of him continued to recede, replaced by a complex mix of weariness, grudging respect, and a profound, aching loneliness. She was still his captive, in a sense, her life entirely in his hands. But he had not harmed her. He had, in his own silent, stoic way, provided for her, protected her from the elements. She began to see him less as a savage captor and more as a man of quiet strength and deep, if alien, principles. The world he inhabited was harsh, demanding, and he met its demands with a competence that was both intimidating and admirable. She was still terrified of what lay ahead, of the Lakota camp and the people there. But the man who led her, she was beginning to realize, was not the monster her prejudiced imagination had conjured. He was simply Lakota. She had heard him murmur the name once, softly, when speaking to his horse. Lakota. It meant friend to all in some interpretation she vaguely recalled from old tales, a bitter irony given her current situation, yet the man himself was proving to be far more complex than any simple label could convey. The air grew sharper, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the terrain became more rugged, the hillsides thick with timber. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the jagged peaks in the west, Lakota reined in his horse at the crest of a ridge. He sat for a long moment, surveying the valley below, his posture alert, watchful. Ilara, drawing starlight up beside him, followed his gaze. Nestled in a sheltered bend of a river, smoke curled lazily from the tops of several teepees. Figures moved among the lodges, the distant, ant-like movements of people going about their daily lives. A dog barked, the sound faint on the breeze. This was it. The Lakota camp. A wave of apprehension, so intense it was almost nauseating, washed over Ilara. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her hands, slick with nervous sweat, tightened on the reins. This was the reality she had been dreading, the destination of their long, silent journey. All the stories, all the fears, all the ingrained prejudices of her upbringing rose up to confront her. She felt utterly alien, exposed, a solitary white woman on the verge of entering a world that was, by all accounts, hostile to her kind. Lakota turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. She could read nothing in his expression, no reassurance, no warning. He simply held her gaze for a moment, then, with a slight inclination of his head, urged his horse forward, down the winding trail that led into the valley. Ilara had no choice but to follow. As they descended, the sounds of the camp grew louder, the murmur of voices, the laughter of children, the rhythmic thud of someone working with wood or hide. The smells, too, became more distinct: wood smoke, roasting meat, the scent of leather and horses. Her stomach clenched. She felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, though Lakota's treatment of her thus far had given no indication of overt malice. It was the unknown, the collective unknown of his people, that terrified her. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. A shout went up from a boy who had been tending a small herd of ponies near the riverbank. He stared, wide-eyed, then turned and ran towards the lodges, his voice carrying the alarm. Figures emerged from the teepees, their faces turning towards the newcomers. Ilara could feel their eyes on her, 100 unseen gazes, curious, suspicious, perhaps hostile. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, a futile gesture of self-protection. Lakota rode steadily into the heart of the camp, dismounting before a teepee slightly larger than the others, its hide painted with intricate symbols she did not understand. An older man, his face deeply lined and his hair grayed at the temples, emerged from this lodge. He wore an air of quiet authority, and his gaze, when it fell upon Ilara, was keen and appraising. Lakota spoke to him in Lakota, his voice low and respectful. The older man listened intently, his eyes flicking occasionally towards Ilara, then back to Lakota. The exchange was brief. Then, the older man nodded slowly. Lakota turned to Ilara. "This is Sun Bear," he said, his English still accented but clear. "He is elder here." He then gestured towards a smaller, unadorned teepee nearby. "You will stay there." Ilara looked at the teepee. It was small, plain, set slightly apart from the others. It felt like a cage, a place of isolation. Women and children had begun to gather at a distance, watching her with open curiosity. Some of the women whispered amongst themselves, their expressions unreadable. She felt a profound sense of alienation, a crushing loneliness that was almost unbearable. She was an outsider here, an object of scrutiny, perhaps of scorn. Lakota led Starlight towards a communal rope line where other horses were tethered, then returned, carrying her meager blanket roll. He did not enter the teepee assigned to her, but placed the roll just inside the flap. "Food will be brought," he said, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the larger lodge with Sun Bear. Ilara stood alone, frozen with uncertainty. What was she supposed to do? Enter the teepee? Wait outside? The eyes of the camp were upon her. Swallowing her fear, she ducked through the low opening of the teepee. Inside, it was dim, the air cool and smelling faintly of smoke and old leather. A few furs were spread on the ground. It was sparse, but clean. She sank onto one of the furs, her body trembling with exhaustion and a renewed sense of dread. Later, as dusk began to settle, a young woman, perhaps a few years older than Ilara, appeared at the teepee entrance. She carried a wooden bowl filled with a steaming stew. She did not speak, did not even meet Ilara's eyes, but simply placed the bowl on the ground near her and withdrew, silent as a shadow. The stew smelled of meat and wild vegetables. Ilara was famished, but her appetite had vanished, chased away by anxiety. Yet, she knew she had to eat, to maintain her strength. She picked up the bowl, her hand shaking. It was a small kindness, this offering of food, but it did little to dispel the overwhelming sense of isolation and fear that gripped her. She was in their world now, subject to their customs, their judgments. And Lakota, her silent, enigmatic guide, had delivered her here, only to seemingly abandon her to her fate. Days in the Lakota camp unfolded with a rhythm alien to Ilara. The rising sun brought a quiet bustle of activity, women tending fires, preparing food, children playing, men departing on hunts or seeing to their horses. Ilara remained largely confined to her small teepee, an isolated figure on the periphery of their lives. The initial curiosity of the camp members had settled into a kind of wary observance. They went about their routines, occasionally casting glances her way, but mostly, they left her alone. Food was brought to her twice a day, usually by the same silent young woman, whose name Ilara learned from a child's passing call was Bright Willow. Bright Willow never spoke to her, never met her gaze, but her actions were not unkind. The food was always sufficient, sometimes even accompanied by a small cake of dried berries or a piece of roasted root. Ilara spent her time in a state of limbo, her thoughts a turbulent sea of fear, loneliness, and a desperate yearning for understanding. What was her status here? Was she a prisoner? A guest? A curiosity soon to be discarded? Lakota was a sporadic presence. She would see him sometimes from a distance, speaking with other men, or working with his horse. He never approached her teepee, never sought her out. It was as if, having delivered her to this place, his responsibility for her had ended. This silence from him was perhaps the hardest thing to bear. On the journey, his quiet presence had been a constant, a fixed point in her terrifyingly uncertain world. Now, his absence felt like a new form of abandonment. Desperate for some purpose, some way to alleviate the crushing boredom and anxiety, Elara began to observe the life of the camp more closely from the flap of her teepee. She watched the women as they worked, scraping hides, sewing buckskin with bone awls, grinding corn, tending small plots of squash and beans near the river. Their hands were never idle. Their movements were efficient, practiced, their faces often serene despite the evident hardship of their lives. She saw a strength in them, a resilience that resonated with a forgotten part of herself. One afternoon, driven by a need to do something, anything, other than sit and brood, Elara cautiously emerged from her teepee. She walked slowly towards the riverbank, where several women were washing clothes, beating them against smooth stones. They stopped their chatter as she approached, their eyes following her. Elara's courage almost failed her, but she pressed on. She knelt by the water's edge, a little distance away from them, and began to wash her own travel-stained skirt, imitating their motions as best she could. The women watched her in silence for a long moment. Then, one of them, an older woman with kind eyes and intricate silver earrings, offered a tentative smile. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a ray of sunshine in Elara's desolate world. Elara returned the smile, a shy, hesitant movement of her lips. No words were exchanged, but a tiny, fragile connection had been made. Slowly, tentatively, Elara began to venture out more. She would gather firewood, carry water from the river, always keeping to the edges of the camp, always mindful of not intruding. She tried to make herself useful in small, unobtrusive ways. She learned by watching. She observed how they cooked, how they mended, how they cared for their children. The language was a barrier, a vast wall separating her from them, but actions, she discovered, could sometimes speak louder than words. One evening, as she sat outside her teepee, trying to mend a tear in her blanket with a sharpened piece of bone she had found, Lakota appeared. He stood watching her for a moment, his expression unreadable as ever. Then, he wordlessly handed her a proper bone needle and a length of sinew thread. Elara stared at the offering, then up at him, her heart giving an unexpected lurch. It was the first direct interaction they'd had since their arrival. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. He merely grunted in acknowledgement and walked away. But the gesture lingered. He was aware of her. He was watching, even from a distance. Perhaps he had not abandoned her entirely. She began to notice other small things. If a particularly fierce wind blew up at night, she would find an extra hide pegged across the entrance of her teepee in the morning. When a new batch of dried meat was prepared, a generous portion would be left for her by Bright Willow. These were unspoken kindnesses, orchestrated, she suspected, by Lakota. Her perception of him continued to evolve. He was not just a stoic warrior. There was a depth to him, a quiet sense of responsibility that he seemed to extend, however reluctantly, to her. He was a man of his word, she was beginning to believe. He had said he would pay her father's debt, and he had. He had said he would take her away from the auction, and he had. What he had not said was what would happen to her *now star. That uncertainty remained, a constant shadow. But the raw edges of her fear were slowly being smoothed away, replaced by a tentative curiosity about these people, this life, and the enigmatic man who had brought her here. She started to try and learn a few words of Lakota, listening intently to the conversations around her, repeating sounds softly to herself. It was a slow, arduous process, but it was a start. She was no longer just a passive victim. She was observing, learning, trying, in her own small way, to build a bridge across the chasm that separated her from this new world. The late summer days shortened, a golden haze settling over the valley as autumn approached. Elara's life in the Lakota camp found a fragile rhythm. she continued her quiet efforts to be useful, her days filled with small, self-appointed tasks, gathering fallen branches for firewood, helping Bright Willow carry water when their paths coincided, mending her own few garments with the needle Lakota had given her. The women of the camp, while still reserved, no longer regarded her with outright suspicion. The older woman with the silver earrings, whose name she learned was Walks with Wind, would sometimes offer a nod or a gentle smile. The children, bolder than their parents, would occasionally approach, their dark eyes wide with curiosity, before being shooed away by their mothers. Ilara learned to say hello, and Pilamaya, thank you, her pronunciation clumsy but her intent sincere. These small attempts at communication were usually met with surprised, sometimes amused, glances, but rarely with open hostility. She was still an outsider, a pale shadow on the edge of their vibrant lives, but the wall of alienation was, perhaps, becoming slightly more permeable. Lakota remained a distant figure, yet his unseen influence continued to shape her existence. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond proof, that her tentative acceptance by the camp, or at least their tolerance of her presence, was due to him. He was a respected warrior, a man of standing, and his unspoken protection extended to her. One crisp morning, Ilara was down by the river, washing the bowl from her morning meal, when she saw Lakota leading his dun mare to the water's edge further upstream. He was alone. As he knelt to let the horse drink, his buckskin shirt pulled taut across his broad shoulders, revealing the lean strength of his frame. He moved with an inherent grace, a quiet confidence that she had come to associate with him. For a moment, their eyes met across the shimmering water. He did not look away immediately, nor did she. In that brief, unguarded instant, she saw not just the stoic warrior, but something deeper, a flicker of weariness perhaps, or a hint of an unspoken burden. Then, he turned back to his horse, the moment broken. Later that day, a group of younger boys were practicing with small bows and arrows, their targets crudely drawn animals on a piece of stretched hide. One of the boys, small and eager, fumbled his shot, his arrow flying wide and landing near where Ilara was sorting through a pile of firewood. He looked crestfallen, and the other boys snickered. Without thinking, Ilara picked up the arrow. It was simply made, fletched with hawk feathers. She remembered her father teaching her, years ago, the basics of archery, more for sport than necessity. On impulse, she walked over to the boy, knelt, and gently adjusted his grip on the bow, showing him how to draw the string back smoothly, how to sight along the arrow. She spoke softly, using the few Lakota words she knew, supplemented by gestures. The boy watched her, his initial surprise giving way to rapt attention. The other boys fell silent, observing. Lakota, who had been repairing a section of fishing net nearby, paused in his work, his gaze fixed on the scene. Ilara, focused on the child, was unaware of his scrutiny. She helped the boy knock another arrow. Steady, she murmured, more to herself than to him. He loosed the arrow. It flew true this time, striking the edge of the target. A small cry of triumph escaped him, and he beamed at Ilara. A rare, genuine smile touched Ilara's lips. In that small act of shared instruction, a tiny spark of connection had been forged. As she straightened up, she caught Lakota's eye. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, then returned to his work. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps even a grudging approval. That evening, Walks with Wind approached Ilara's teepee. She carried a small bundle. Inside were soft, cured deer hides and a bone awl, finer than the one Lakota had given her. Walks with Wind gestured towards Ilara's worn calico dress, then to the hides, then made sewing motions. It was an invitation, an offering of materials and, implicitly, instruction. Ilara's eyes welled with unexpected tears. "Pilamaya," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Pilamaya ye." Walks with Wind patted her arm gently, her smile warm and genuine. The next few weeks, Ilara spent many hours with Walks with Wind and a few other women, learning the intricate art of Lakota beadwork and sewing. Her fingers, at first clumsy, gradually grew more adept. The language barrier remained, but they communicated through gestures, through shared laughter at her mistakes, through the quiet camaraderie of women working together. She learned more Lakota words, phrases, the cadence of their speech becoming more familiar. She was still Elara Hayes, the rancher's daughter, but something new was being stitched into the fabric of her being, thread by thread. She no longer felt like a complete outcast. She was still different, her past a world away, but she was finding a tentative place, a niche, however small, in this community. And through it all, Lakota watched from a distance, his silence no longer a source of pure fear, but a complex, enigmatic presence in her slowly changing world. The unspoken understanding between them was growing, forged not in words, but in shared space, in observed actions, in the harsh beauty of the land that was now, for better or worse, her temporary home. The vibrant hues of autumn deepened, painting the valley in shades of gold, russet, and crimson. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of approaching winter. The Lakota camp was a hive of activity as preparations were made for the colder months, meat was dried, hides were tanned, and winter stores were gathered. Elara, now a more familiar, if still distinct, presence, found herself increasingly drawn into the communal efforts, her assistance accepted, sometimes even sought. Her skill with a needle, honed under walks with Wind's patient tutelage, proved useful, and she spent many hours helping to mend winter clothing or repair teepee covers. One afternoon, a hunting party returned, their ponies laden with deer. There was an air of quiet satisfaction in the camp. Lakota had been among them. Elara saw him from a distance, tired but upright, his face streaked with dust and exertion. Later, as the women worked together to process the meat, a commotion arose from the edge of the camp. Shouts, angry and unfamiliar, cut through the crisp air. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. Men from the camp, Lakota among them, moved quickly towards the source of the disturbance, their expressions grim. Elara, along with the other women and children, drew back, fear coiling in her stomach. She could see them now, 3 white men on horseback, rough-looking, heavily armed. One of them, burly and with a sneering face, looked chillingly familiar. It was one of Blackwood's enforcers, the man who had stood guard at the auction. Her blood ran cold. They had found them. How? Why? Had Blackwood sent them? Were they here for her? The man's gaze swept over the camp, and then it landed on Elara. A predatory glint lit his eyes. There she is, he yelled, pointing directly at her. The runaway property. We've come to collect what's ours, Blackwood's due. Lakota stepped forward, placing himself between Elara and the intruders. Several other Lakota warriors fanned out beside him, their bows narked, their expressions resolute. She is not property, Lakota's voice rang out, clear and cold. She is with our people. You have no claim here. The enforcer laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She's white, ain't she? Blackwood paid good money for her, and you Injun stole her. We're here to take her back. And maybe teach you a lesson about interfering with white folks' business. His companions unslung their rifles, their movements menacing. The tension was a razor's edge. Elara watched, terrified, as the confrontation escalated. This was her fault. Her presence had brought this danger to the camp, to these people who had, in their own way, offered her shelter. Guilt and fear warred within her. The enforcer spurred his horse forward a few steps. Last chance, Redskin. Hand her over, and we might just ride out peaceful. Lakota did not flinch. You will leave this place, he stated, his voice like flint. Or you will not leave at all. The enforcer's face contorted with rage. You threatening me, savage? He raised his rifle. Maybe you need a taste of this. In that instant, Elara acted. She didn't think, she reacted. Seeing one of the other intruders subtly shifting his aim towards Lakota's exposed side while Lakota's attention was fixed on the lead enforcer, she screamed, Lakota, look out! Her voice, shrill with terror, cut through the tense silence. Lakota's head snapped towards her, then, following her desperate gaze, he whirled just as the second man fired. The bullet whizzed past where Lakota had been standing moments before, thudding harmlessly into the earth. The momentary distraction, however, was all the Lakota warriors needed. Arrows flew, silent and deadly. One of the intruders cried out, clutching his shoulder as his rifle clattered to the ground. The lead enforcer, startled by the sudden attack and Ilara's warning, hesitated for a fatal second. Lakota moved with lightning speed, his war club a blur as he disarmed the man, sending him sprawling from his horse. The third intruder, seeing his companions downed, wheeled his horse and fled, arrows whistling past his ears. It was over in moments. The remaining two enforcers, one wounded, the other dazed, were quickly surrounded and disarmed. Silence descended, broken only by the moans of the injured man and the heavy breathing of the combatants. Ilara stood trembling, her hand pressed to her mouth, the echo of her own scream still ringing in her ears. Lakota walked over to her, his face grim, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a new expression. It was not gratitude, exactly, but a profound, searching look that seemed to see into the very core of her being. He stopped before her, his chest still heaving slightly from the exertion. "You are not hurt?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, unable to speak. He nodded, then turned his attention to the captured men. The camp was in an uproar, but it was a controlled chaos. The wounded man was being tended to, albeit gruffly. The other was bound securely. Sun Bear and the other elders conferred with Lakota, their voices urgent. Ilara watched, feeling a strange mixture of relief and a renewed sense of dread. She had helped, yes, but she had also been the cause of this violence. Would they blame her? Would this fragile acceptance she had begun to find be shattered? Later, after the captives had been dealt with, disarmed, their horses confiscated, and sent walking back towards the white settlements with a stern warning never to return, Lakota sought her out. He found her by the river, where she had retreated to try and calm her frayed nerves. He stood beside her, looking out at the water flowing endlessly past. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, he turned to her. "Your warning," he said, his voice quiet. "It saved my life." Ilara looked up at him, her eyes wide. I just reacted." "You reacted with courage," he corrected her gently. "You chose a side. You chose us." His words hung in the air between them. You chose us. It was a profound statement. In that moment of crisis, she had not thought of herself as white, or them as Lakota. She had seen a man she respected, people who had shown her kindness, threatened, and she had acted to protect them. He reached out, his calloused fingers lightly touching her arm. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of connection, far more eloquent than any words. "The debt," he said softly, "is now balanced in a different way." Ilara felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of belonging that was startling in its intensity. She was no longer just Ilara Hayes, the auctioned rancher's daughter. She was someone who had faced danger, who had found an unexpected strength within herself, and who had, in some small way, earned her place. The aftermath of the confrontation settled upon the camp like the first frost of winter, a chilling reminder of the precariousness of their existence, but also a catalyst for change. The two captured enforcers, stripped of their weapons and horses, had been sent packing with stern injunctions never to return, their tale of failure likely to discourage Blackwood or others from similar ventures, at least for a time. Yet, the incident left an indelible mark. For Ilara, it was a crucible. Her scream, her instinctive act of warning Lakota, had been a turning point. It was as if a dam within her had broken, releasing a current of courage she hadn't known she possessed. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it no longer paralyzed her. It was now tempered by a newfound resilience, a quiet determination. In the days that followed, she noticed a subtle shift in the way the Lakota people regarded her. The reserve was still present, for she would always be different, an outlander with a past rooted in a world often at odds with theirs. But now, mingled with that reserve, was a measure of respect. They had seen her act not as a helpless captive, but as an ally, someone who had risked her own safety for one of theirs. Walks with Wind smiles were warmer, her gestures of instruction more inclusive. Children no longer just stared but would sometimes shyly offer her a brightly colored stone or a late autumn berry. Even the younger warriors, who had previously regarded her with indifference or suspicion, now offered curt nods of acknowledgement. The most significant change, however, was in her relationship with Lakota. The wall of silence between them, while not entirely dismantled, had become more porous. He began to speak to her more often, not in lengthy conversations, but in brief exchanges, sharing observations about the changing weather or explaining a particular custom of his people. He taught her the Lakota names for the plants she gathered, the animals whose tracks they saw. He showed her how to read the signs of the coming winter in the behavior of the geese and the thickness of the beaver's coat. His voice, when he spoke to her, was still low and measured, but it had lost some of its earlier gruffness, replaced by a tone of patient instruction, almost of mentorship. One evening, as they sat by a communal fire, the air sharp with the scent of burning pine, he looked at her thoughtfully. "You have a Lakota heart, Ilara Hayes," he said, using her full name for the first time in a way that sounded less like an identification and more like an observation. Ilara felt a flush creep up her neck. I only did what anyone would do." Lakota shook his head slowly. "Not everyone. Many in your world would have seen only an enemy. You saw a man." His words resonated deeply within her. He understood. He saw beyond her white skin, beyond her origins, to the person she was trying to become. She had spent so much of her life defined by loss, by what had been taken from her, her mother, her father, her home, her dignity. Now, in this alien and often harsh environment, she was beginning to find something new, something that was hers alone, a sense of self-worth, a quiet strength forged in adversity. She reflected on how far she had come from the terrified, desperate girl cowering in the barn. That girl was still a part of her, her fear and grief etched into her memory. But she was no longer solely defined by that vulnerability. She had faced death, faced judgment, faced her own deepest prejudices, and she had survived. More than survived, she had begun to grow. The auction, the degradation, the fear, those were scars she would always carry. But scars, she was learning, could also be symbols of resilience, of battles fought and overcome. Her father's ranch was gone, a ghost on the windswept plains. The life she had known was irrevocably lost. But perhaps, she thought, looking around at the firelit faces of the Lakota people, at Lakota's strong, quiet presence beside her, perhaps a new life, a different kind of belonging, was possible. It would not be easy. The challenges were immense. But for the first time in a very long time, Ilara felt a flicker of something that resembled hope, fragile yet persistent, like the first green shoot pushing through the frozen earth after a long winter. She had found a strength she did not know she possessed, and in the eyes of this stoic warrior, she saw not a captor, but a protector, a teacher, and perhaps, something more. Winter arrived, cloaking the valley in a thick blanket of snow. The river froze along its edges, and the wind howled through the pines with a mournful sound that no longer filled Ilara with the same dread it once had. Life in the camp slowed, turned inward. The teepees, banked with snow for insulation, became smoky, firelit havens against the bitter cold. Days were spent mending gear, telling stories, conserving precious resources. Ilara, now dressed in warm, practical buckskin sewn by her own hand under walks with wind's guidance, had found her place within this winter rhythm. She helped with the endless tasks of survival, grinding dried corn into meal, softening hides, tending the fires. Her Lakota vocabulary had expanded, and while she was far from fluent, she could now understand much of what was said around her and make her own needs and thoughts known, however simply. The terror that had once consumed her had largely faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance of her new reality. She was no longer Ilara Hayes, the auctioned rancher's daughter, defined solely by her loss and her otherness. She was Ilara, a woman who had endured, who had learned, who had found an unexpected capacity for resilience within herself. Her transformation was not just internal. The harsh life had sculpted her, stripping away any remaining softness, leaving her leaner, stronger. Her hands were calloused, her skin weathered, but her eyes held a new clarity, a steady resolve. She had earned her keep, earned the respect of these people, not by trying to be one of them, for that she could never truly be, but by being herself, by contributing what she could, by meeting hardship with courage. Lakota remained a constant, reassuring presence. The unspoken bond between them had deepened, forged in shared experiences, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that often transcends words. He continued to be her teacher, sharing his knowledge of the land, the seasons, the ways of his people. But he was also becoming her confidant, in his own reserved way. Sometimes, in the long evenings, they would sit together, not necessarily talking, but sharing the silence, a comfortable companionship that warmed Elara more than any fire. He would tell her stories of his youth, of hunts and visions, of the spirits that inhabited the mountains and the plains. And she, in turn, would speak of her father, of the ranch, of the life that now seemed a distant dream. He listened patiently, his dark eyes thoughtful, never judging, always offering a quiet understanding. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, whipping snow against the taut hides of the teepee, Lakota looked at her across the flickering firelight. "The winter will pass," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When the thaws come, the trails will open. You will have a choice to make." Elara met his gaze. She knew what he meant. She could attempt to return to the white settlements, to try and build some semblance of a life in the world she had once known. Or she could stay. The thought of leaving, which had once been her only desperate hope, now filled her with a surprising ambivalence. What was there for her to return to? A world that had deemed her worthless, that had sought to sell her like livestock? A world where she would always be marked by her ordeal, an object of pity or scorn? Here, among the Lakota, she had found something she had never expected, a sense of purpose, a community, however alien at first, and a profound connection with a man who saw her, truly saw her, for who she was. "I know," she said softly. The choice weighed heavily on her, yet it was a choice she now felt strong enough to make, whatever it might be. Her journey had been one of unimaginable hardship, from the depths of despair and vulnerability to a place of quiet strength and self-acceptance. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in her own destiny. The auction block was a fading nightmare. The harshness of the plains had become a familiar landscape. The Lakota warrior who had once been a figure of terror was now her anchor, her steadfast companion. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the teepee walls, Elara looked at Lakota. His face, illuminated by the warm light, was strong, serene. He offered her a rare, almost imperceptible smile. In that moment, she felt a sense of peace she had not known since childhood. The future was still uncertain, a path veiled in mist. But she would walk it with her head held high, her spirit unbroken, her heart filled with a quiet, resilient hope. She had been set for auction, a life nearly sold, until a Lakota warrior had stepped in. He had not just saved her from a cruel fate, he had, in his own way, shown her the path to saving herself. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. The wind howled outside, but within the small, firelit teepee, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames, a connection that promised not an easy future, but a shared one, built on courage, resilience, and the unexpected grace of the human heart.